With internet security becoming a main concern, we need a better solution for our homes and businesses. Though there's several software packages out there that you can use, today I want to cover my favorite, Sophos version 18. If you want to learn more about how to set it up, how to configure it, and how to get it working for the first time, then definitely stick around for this video. And if you haven't already done so, then please subscribe and click that notifications icon so you'll be notified of new content. In today's video, I want to cover the basic configuration, talk a little bit about rules, web filtering, and application filtering. We'll also cover some of the recommended settings so that you can get your firewall up and running pretty easily. The hardware requirements for version 18 are identical to the prior version. You need at least 2 or more NIC cards, 4 gigs of RAM, and a minimum of 10 gig hard drive or SSD, but they recommend 64. Since you actually have to set up and install version 17.5 before you can run version 18, at least as of this video, I'm not going to be going through the software installation because I've done a previous video on that, which I'll post a link to. And we'll pick up this video that once you've installed the latest version of 17.5 and show you how to upgrade the firmware and then go from there. So assuming that you've installed version 17.5, you're now at a point where we have to manually upgrade to version 18. So we're going to do that by going over to the firmware section. We're going to click on upload firmware, which is the first button. We're going to choose the file that we downloaded from their website for the new update. And then we're going to go ahead and hit upload and boot. And what that does is it actually uploads the firmware, installs it, and then reboots the device. And it takes a few minutes to do this because it has to actually install it, reboot, and then you'll be able to log back into the web interface with the new version 18. It also warns you that this is going to boot on factory configurations. And again, this is a clean install. This is not an in-place upgrade. So it will reset because version 18 has got a little bit different settings. So if you're doing this to an existing version, this is a slightly different process that you're going to follow. So assuming you've installed it and you've updated to version 18 successfully, you should be now looking at the login screen once you log back in. So you're looking at basically the control center. So I want to go over a couple of things that we need to do before this thing will even communicate, because out of the box on a new install there is no internet communication. It's locked down. So we now have to go ahead and make a few changes and then allow it to communicate. So before we get into the rules, let's just take a couple of check into the network cards just to make sure they're being picked up correctly. So let's click over to network and let's go over to the interfaces and let's make sure that we have our interfaces correctly. And again, this is assuming you're using at least 2 NICs. And all we're going to do right now is configure 2 NICs. So we have 1 WAN and 1 LAN. So if we look at the ports, we can see that they have an address. So they seem to be connected and working okay. So that's the first thing we want to check. And we're going to make some additional changes to these interface cards a little bit later to change the DHCP range. But for now, let's leave them alone. Let's go to rules and policies. Apparently, as I mentioned, out of the box, this thing is not going to communicate. And we can verify that by trying to get to a website here. And you can see it doesn't really connect to anything. It doesn't work. So let's find out why, and let's see what we need to do to change it. And as I mentioned, this is normal. This is normal behavior out of the box. What they do is they create some sample rules for us so that to get you started. And we're going to make some drastic changes to these rules. So the first thing is they have kind of pre-configured some example rules. On a typical network where you're just interested in getting internal LAN communication and going out to the internet, we don't need this first rule at all. This is designed for something completely different. So what I'm going to do is actually delete this. And I do this even though I look at this, the rule itself is not enabled. I just don't want it there. So I'm going to take this out just because I want to keep things clean and I want to keep my firewall clean. So I'm going to take these out. It says delete, okay. Okay, and then the other one I want to take out is these next two because This particular rule that they create by default is really for mail servers, and most of us don't run mail servers at home. And so we're going to take that one out. And DMZ traffic. Again, most of us are not running servers at home, at least servers exposed to the internet, because that brings in a whole new level of complications. So if you're doing that, you're probably not, you're going to need more than this video. So for now, because it's just in my way, I'm going to go ahead and take that out as well. So what I've got here, let me go ahead and click OK. So what I'm left here is with basically two rules. One that I cannot change, which is the drop all or block all. And the other is traffic to WAN, which is really the one I want. So let's click this little plus sign here, and let's see that we have a rule here that's basically designed to allow traffic. But unfortunately, by default, they've got it set to drop, which means it's not going to allow any traffic through. The other thing is I may not want to change this rule for now, so to play around and to experiment, what I'm going to do is actually clone this. I'm going to clone the rule above, and I'm going to change this to accept traffic. And that's really all I'm going to change right now. So I'm going to say clone. So now if we look at the plus sign, we see that the rule that was originally created and now the clone rule, but they're both disabled. So let's go ahead and turn the one that we just created on. So our clone rule, which we probably should rename as default traffic or something more creative than clone example, but for practical purposes, we've now enabled this rule, which allows, let's take a quick look at it, which accepts traffic to the WAN from any source, from any network, basically at any scheduled time, to the WAN, to any destination, any service. And that's what we want. Right now, for all traffic, that's what we want. We're going to get into this filtering and web filtering, application filtering a little bit later. So for now, we just want to make sure that we're establishing some traffic. So let's go back and take a look at this. We can now see that this has been enabled. And let's make sure we get traffic. And there we go. We have traffic. So now what we've done is basically get our firewall to actually communicate and allow traffic out. Currently, as it's presently set up, all we really have is just standard network translation. So we're not doing any kind of filtering or anything like that yet. That'll be the next step. There's one more thing I want to explain, and I've done a more detailed video on this, which I'll link to in the description. This is about the NAT rules. That requires a little bit more explanation. But for all practical purposes, with the version 18, all of your outgoing firewall rules will travel through this NAT rule. Because assuming you only have one internet connection and you're not doing any type of load balancing or anything like that, this is all you're really going to see. Now, as we do port forwards and stuff, which again I've covered on a different video, that will change, and you'll see a couple more of these depending on how many port forwards you do. But for this example, we're only going to have the one NAT rule. It's a common rule to all. We'll take a quick look at it just in case you haven't seen one before. But all it basically says is that it's going to take any source, any destination, any service, and it's going to do an SNAT on it, or source network address translation, and it's going to output it to the WAN, or to port 2, which is the WAN. That's really all this does. So let's go back to policies again. So obviously on yours, you're going to probably rename these. You don't necessarily have to have these groups. By default, it tries to group things into common functions. If you prefer to have your rule out of the group, you can just say detach, and it will remove it from the group and make it as a standalone rule, which is what I prefer to do because I'm not creating 1,000 rules on my home network. So I prefer to have them listed out so that I can see. I group things like port forwards and VPNs, things like that on my current configuration. But this allows me to see quickly what's going on because I don't really need to see this group. This group really has only the disabled group, the disabled rule that was originally created. So I hope that makes sense. So basically, just to summarize, all we've done right now is copy the original rule that it created for us, enable traffic to go out, and that's really all we've done. So now all the traffic is going through this one firewall rule, and if the traffic is not coming from any of these sources, it's going to get blocked. Obviously, anything plugged into your local LAN is going to go out. Okay, so now that we've finished the firewall rules, let's start to customize this and add some filtering and some protection for our network. So let's drop down over to web. And let me just collapse this real quick. There is a bunch of pre-made policies for you that you can adjust and use out of the box, or you can tune them and whatever you'd like to do with them. There's a default policy, and we're going to play with that for a little bit. So if we take a look at the default policy, it has some pre-made categories for us. Only 2 of them are actually turned on, and you can see here that the status is actually enabled. The rest of these have been turned off. Now I can do several things from here. I can actually just modify this default policy and use that as into my firewall rules, or I can clone it and so I don't damage the original default policy, or I can create one from scratch. I can go up here to add policy, and I can start to build a rule from scratch by building these default actions. So we're not going to do that right now. We're going to go ahead and actually modify the default policy because that's the one that's kind of already made for us. So let's go up here and see what's inside this policy, and maybe we're going to add a couple of things to it just to keep it interesting. So the first thing we want to do on the default policy is actually scan what's turned on. So these two, there's a list here of that you can create of a group of blocked URLs. So if you look under here where it says URL groups, there's a group called blocked URLs that you can add actual domains to. It's continuous live documents, so you can keep adding to it and it will block those from taking place. But for now, since that's already on, risky downloads and suspicious we're going to have on. We're going to filter those out. For purposes of this discussion, let's go ahead and filter adult content, and let's leave that alone for now. So we're going to go ahead and apply changes. I'm going to skip this step for now because we're going to do that manually, so I want to show you how to do that. But before we do that, I want to show you how to add a category to this thing. So let's say, for example, we'll go to the last entry here, and let's say I want to add another category. Maybe I don't like these. Maybe I want to delete some of these, and maybe I want to add my own. So we're going to go ahead and click on Add a Rule below, and it creates this default all web traffic thing, which is not what we want. We want a specific category. So let's go ahead and modify this category that we just added in, since it's defaulting at all web traffic. So let's go ahead and modify this thing. So right now it defaults to all web traffic. That's probably not good enough. So let's go ahead and click on Add Item. And then what we're going to do is disable all web traffic, and we're going to go down and hit, let's say, criminal activities, and let's say drugs, controlled substance, and extreme violence. And let's apply those 3. So what we end up with here is a rule that's added these 3 categories. So, and this has been added to our default policy. And I want to do is turn this on. So if we review what we've done here, we have turned on risky downloads and suspicious websites, adult content, and then we've created a new category with 3 different web content filters in it. Criminal activities, drug and controlled substances, and extreme violence. And I'm going to go ahead and apply those. And I'm going to skip this step for now. And so I have now modified my default policy. So now the question is, what do I do with it? So let's go back over to rules and policies. Let's take a look at the rule that we created earlier. And let's scroll down to the bottom. And if we look here, it says web filtering. Let's click on web filtering and let's drop down and say the default policy that we modified. So all the traffic for this fire rule is going to go through this web filtering policy. So I'm going to click save. That's all we're going to do right now. We're going to be back to this later. Okay, so if we look here, examine the rule here, we'll see that it's the web filter has been active. So now we're running everything through the default web policy. We're logging traffic and we're accepting all traffic to go through. So if I go here to my, let's go to, just for the heck of it, Yahoo. We are still able to go through traffic. We're still able to do anything we need to. We shouldn't see any problems unless there's an ad or something it doesn't like based on the categories that we've picked. And of course, if I try and surf to a website that meets one of those categories that's in that default policy, it's not going to let me go through. So I've accomplished some level of web filtering. Now again, you can add as many categories as you want with this thing. You can get pretty crazy, and as you see when we get into the next section, this really adds to the whole power of what Sophos can do. Now that we've completed the section on web filtering, let's take a quick look at application filtering, because that's equally as powerful. And it can be confusing. So let's take a look at application filtering. Now, if we look at application filtering, there's already some made for us. And there's some kind of default categories. So for example, high-risk apps, peer-to-peer, very high-risk apps. So those are all things that we can actually use out of the box. So we can use any of these rules in our application filtering. However, I feel it's important to show you how to create your own, because everybody has different needs. What you can do a couple different things. Again, you can take any one of these rules, for example, and go ahead and edit and modify that and add criteria to it. But to see how all this stuff works out and how you get this mess, it's easier, I find, to show you how to do it from scratch. So let's go ahead and add one, and we'll call it test. I don't really need a description. And I'm going to hit save. And if I go back and edit this test rule, I can see that now I've got a new section that allows me to add app filters. So let's take a look at that, and let's add our first filter. So for starters, we are able to actually kind of do searching and kind of really start to filter this thing out the way we want. So for example, let's say I want peer-to-peer. It's found a whole bunch of peer-to-peer applications here. You can see the entire list of different ones. And if I'm happy with that, I can actually hit save. And what it's done is it's listed all those applications in my P2P filter. I could have named that anything I wanted to. The other thing is, I want to make sure that I change, because I sometimes forget, is I don't want to allow. And I'm going to say deny, save. So now what you see is all the peer-to-peer networks that Sophos knows about, and the schedule's on all the time, and the action is deny. So anytime it sees a peer-to-peer network, it's going to deny it. So let's go ahead and save that. And you can see that it appears here. Now again, I can go through and I can take an existing rule and I can start adding categories to it. But just to keep things clean, I always find it's easier for me to add a new one and then start to modify it. Now this is just one category. I can add another category. I can say, show me anything that's at high risk, very high risk. And it's found all kinds of stuff. And of course I can review this list and see what's on there. And I may agree and I may not agree with everything here. If I do agree with everything here, I can select deny and save. If I don't agree, I can hit select individual applications and click on name and selectively, for example, let's take out ASUS Web Storage. Not listening to AOL radio. So I can go through this list basically and select the items I want that meet that category, because not everything is going to meet your requirements. So let's assume for a moment that that's good enough. I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and I encourage you to go through the list carefully before hitting save, so you kind of know what to expect when you start using the rule. And you can see it's now added a second section. It's taken care of a lot of peer-to-peers, and now I've got a lot of high-risk stuff. And high risk is determined by Sophos on this particular list, which is why I encourage you to go through the list and make sure you're happy with it. You can go back at any time and make changes. So you can go to Edit, and you go and say, okay, I do want AOL, and I do want Absolute, and hit Save. And it's going to modify that rule for you. So you start to customize this filter the way you want. And you can do this as many times as you want. The one that some people like to use is actually VPNs. So if I click on Add, and I might say, let's do it this way. Let's just say VPN. So it's located a whole pile of VPN services. And maybe I don't want those to be used and to bypass my firewall. So I'm going to go ahead and click deny, hit save. And what that's going to do is block all the use of VPNs that are coming in and out of your network. So not necessarily what you want to do. I'm just giving you an example. So when I'm all done, I hit save. And now my test rule has got 3 categories in it. It's got VPNs, it's got high risk, and it's got peer-to-peers. So I've built this gigantic application filter. Now what do I do with it? So we go back to rules and policies, go back to that default rule that I made, and I'm going to now go down to the bottom here, and here's where we had set the default policy for web. Now let's take a look at setting up app control. So if I go to app control, I should be able to see the test one that I just created. Click on that, and I'm basically done. Now there's one last thing we want to set here that we're probably not going to change at this point, and that's just a general IPS policy, LAN to WAN. And that basically completes our filters. So now we've just added a pile of filters and some high performance security to our Sophos in just a few minutes. It didn't take us a lot of time, and it's so customizable, but you'll have to spend a little bit of time deciding what you want. I would encourage you to start slow and work your way across. Okay, so we've covered basically web filtering, application filtering, IPS. There's a couple things that we really should take a look at and maybe make some minor changes to it just to give you the kind of performance or the kind of results that you're expecting, I should say. So the main thing I want to draw your attention to is the default configuration for DHCP. So let's go over to network. Let's go over to DHCP. And we can see here our DHCP, our default DHCP server here is ranged at, well, let's go ahead and click edit here. The range on this is 17 to 254. The problem with that is the way that Sophos handles static IPs is they have to be manually assigned, and they're always below the range of the DHCP. So I'm going to show you how to do static IPs, but the bottom line is I want to make sure that we have enough room to create those static IPs. Because if you're like me, you may have 20, 30, 40 of them that you want to create just because you might want to control them. And a perfect example for that are your Rokus and Apple TVs. Those are easier to, those better if you put those on a static IP. That way you can create a bypass rule to allow them to work correctly. And you'll do that by having that range of IPs and being able to assign that to a firewall rule. We'll cover that on a different video. But for here, the main thing I want to do and talk about is I want to change this 17 to 100 or some other number. It doesn't matter. But what I'm really doing here is I'm allowing roughly 83 IP addresses to be manually assigned. So I'll be able to provide a lot of static IP addresses should I need them. So my DHCP now will serve between 100 and 254, and that's what I want. So let's go ahead and hit save. And let's just go back in real quick and let's take a look on how we assign IP addresses or static IPs. And this is really simple. I'm just going to call it test. And here we'll put a MAC address in, which I don't have handy. And we'll give it a manual IP address that we're looking for underneath this 100 range and above the 16, which is the gateway. And that's all you got to do. You hit tab and you keep building new ones that you want to build. So by doing this, what it allows me to do is to provide a little bit more flexibility. So now that I've got my firewall running, I've got it filtering, I've got it protecting everything that's inside, and I'm basically blocking access to things that I don't want people to have. I'm now ready to go and ready to deploy. As you add items such as, maybe IoT devices or things like that, ultimately we're going to set those up on a VLAN, but we'll cover that on a separate video. The main thing I wanted to cover here with the DHCP is that I wanted to shorten the range down and provide more range for static IPs. Servers, Plex servers, things like that are easier if you have a static IP so that you don't get yourself messed up. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. I think for the most part, that's about it for this initial video to get you running right out of the box on a fresh installation. I certainly hope that you found this useful, and if you have any questions or comments on this, feel free to post them in the comments below. I really appreciate you listening to this. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe and click that notifications icon so you'll be notified of future content, and we'll see you on the next video.